But I thought I would start with talking about Louis XVI in the context of kings. Because, of course, by the very fact that he is called Louis XVI, it gives you an idea that there were many Louis before him. And the Louis I'm going to start talking about is Louis XIV, who was his great-great-great-great-grandfather. And this is a lovely picture of Louis XIV. And you can see in this wonderful picture of Louis XIV that he's standing in a full suit of armor. He has a big, big black curly wig on with two little horns sticking out of his head. This was a wig that people of the highest classes would wear. He's holding in his hand a baton of the Maréchal de France. This was a military baton. It's blue and it's covered with fleur-de-lis, and it was given to a man when he obtained the highest rank possible in the army. And so he's holding one of those, and it's resting on a helmet, a military helmet. His hair is flying in the wind. His sash is flying in the wind. He's covered with sashes and medals, and in the background, a battle is raging. Now, it might be fun for students to look at various portraits of these kings and try to analyze the portraits because they're very interesting. And I picked this one because it showed Louis XIV as very much the warrior king. And Louis XIV did fight many wars during his reign, and he fought these wars to bring glory to himself and therefore bring glory to France. And other images of Louis XIV often show him showing off his legs, which were very important. It's kind of a symbol of the power, the foundation he was standing on. And they also show him with various symbols of royalty, such as a crown or a scepter, things like that. And in the background, often there will be ships sailing or there will be a battle fighting. And so this kind of presenting this image of Louis XIV as a very warrior king. And he did fight a lot of wars, and he was also probably the best absolute monarch that France ever saw. And while Louis XIV did not invent the concept of absolutism, he had inherited it from his forebears, but he perhaps perfected it. And so by absolutism, I mean that Louis XIV was in charge of everything, and everything came back to him. No one had power apart from him, and he was able to cultivate a certain personality and a certain presence that everybody would want to be attracted to him and be close to him. And so all power emanated from Louis XIV. And if an individual did have some power, it was only because Louis XIV allowed it or had given it to him. And he could show, Louis XIV would show favor in certain ways. One of the more interesting things about Louis XIV, which shows how he was able to kind of keep everyone in his own sphere of influence, was his morning wake-up ceremony. And when Louis XIV would wake up in the morning, all of the various nobles, only the most important nobles though, would be allowed in his chamber to help him get dressed in the morning, or to help him wash his face, or to help him put on his stockings. And the closer the garments were to the actual king's body, the higher rank you was if you got to hand them to him. So whoever got to hand the king his stockings was pretty well managed, whereas the man who got to hand the king his gloves, while still a very powerful figure because he got to be in the bedroom when the king woke up in the morning, wasn't as important as maybe the person who handed the king his first shirt. And so the idea that people would be very eager to serve the king by handing him pieces of clothing or by getting to serve him at his dinner table kind of is just an example of this wonderful sphere of influence that Louis XIV created. And he had the kind of powerful personality that could rule in this way. But because he also perfected absolutism, the king is the sole person in power, he kind of created a system that would become very dependent on who that individual in power was. So if you could carry off absolutism like Louis XIV could, you would do pretty well as a monarch. But if you were not as strong as Louis XIV, you would not have as much success as a monarch. And this brings in the next Louis. This is Louis XV. Now, Louis XV was the great-grandson of Louis XIV. Louis XIV, who is not here, who is here. Louis XIV was a very long-lasting monarch. He lived for a very long time. He outlived his own son. He outlived his own grandson. So when Louis XIV finally died, he left the throne to a little 5-year-old Louis XV, who is pictured here. And by the time Louis XV has his portrait painted, and there are also many portraits of Louis XV, styles had changed, times had changed a little bit, so he's going to look a little different from his great-grandfather. However, you can already tell that this is a different kind of person. Here he is, he's wearing regular clothes, he's not wearing armor. He has some medals and some badges on him, which indicate that he has seen battle and that he's in charge of an army. And Louis XV did have a warrior moment. I would not call him a warrior king, but he did have his warrior moment. Louis XV was also known as the bien-aimé, the well-liked king, although by the time he died, he wasn't as well-liked as he had been in his youth. And you can also see that in this portrait, you see lots of beautiful fabrics around him, and you see that he's also holding on to a baton for the Maréchal de France, this important blue cudgel that had the fleur-de-lis on it that was always given to the highest-ranking members of the French army. So he's still holding on to that, but there's no battle going on in the background. He's not wearing armor. There's otherwise little indication that he's involved militarily, and it doesn't present the same striking image that Louis XIV did. And so this is another interesting portrait to show perhaps the students and let them kind of analyze the portrait and see if they can divine from looking at the objects in the portrait what kind of king Louis XV was. Louis XV was not the monarch that Louis XIV was, and granted it would be very hard to fill Louis XIV's shoes, so we have to give Louis XV that. But Louis XV became more famous for his scandals at court than for anything that he did on the battlefield. And at one time, the biggest scandal surrounded his taking as mistresses 3 sisters in succession of each other, which was very frowned upon, especially by the Catholic Church, because that was considered incest. And because Louis XV was very hesitant to give up any of his mistresses, although he gave them up twice, but he would always take them back. But because Louis XV was very hesitant to give up his mistresses, he was unable to take communion. And because Louis XV was unable to take communion and reconcile himself with God in accordance with Catholic tradition, he was not able to perform healings, which is something that French kings had been believed to be able to do. And it used to be custom that the French king would go out about once a year, once every couple of years, and he would go about his kingdom and he would heal people with his touch, because that was apparently because the king was made king by God, and because he was king only because God had made this person king, he was able to perform certain healings. And Louis XV, because he would not give up his mistresses, he could not take communion, therefore he could not heal. And so some of those traditions that came along with the more spiritual side of the monarch and that showed off the monarch as more than just a simple man faded under the reign of Louis XV. And then you move on to the portrait of Louis XVI. Again, there are many portraits of Louis XVI, and I'll be showing some other portraits of him during the lecture as well, but this is the one that the Society of the Cincinnati has on display. And of course, the Society of Cincinnati is very enamored with Louis XVI because he did help America so much, even though he did so mostly under the influence of Vergennes. But Louis XVI agreed with Vergennes and signed off on many of the things that the French did to help America. But you see, okay, that in this portrait, if you look at Louis XVI, you can tell from the background that this portrait's inside, or maybe it's on a balcony, because you see a marble column here and kind of a balcony over here. There's nothing much going on in the background. You can see maybe part of a statue of a ship, but there's no battle in the background. There aren't any ships in the background, which is different. He's obviously not wearing any armor, like Louis XIV was. He has one medallion right here, but he isn't covered with medals the way Louis XV was. So again, he looks even farther separated from the French army. He also does not have a baton like Louis XV and Louis XIV did. Instead, he has a bit of a scepter here, and there's a crown in the background, and he's just holding a very pretty hat in his hand. So if you kind of look at the portraits and you kind of analyze the portraits of the king, you kind of see how the French monarchy went from Louis XIV, who was this very powerful, very dominating, very warrior-like absolute monarch, to Louis XVI, who is nothing like Louis XIV. Louis XV is the absolute kingship is a little more watered down, and then you get to Louis XVI, and you see very little of Louis XIV, really, in Louis XVI. Louis XVI was also strikes me anyway from my research as being a very nice man, if not a very good king. And sometimes being a nice person and being a good ruler do not go hand in hand, because while Louis XIV could be very repressive in his reign, and while he could be very harsh in his retributions or harsh in some of his policies, he was able to keep the country very stable, and France as a whole blossomed under Louis XIV in many ways. Whereas under Louis XVI, while he was a very nice individual, it seems like, the country did not exactly blossom under Louis XVI, though it went through some pretty important transformations. And I'll talk about those in a little bit.